Alright guys, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and just real quick, let you know, the website and the new blog are being worked on, and they will be up here in the next couple weeks. Also, the next free giveaway, if you're not subscribed for that, to sign up for it, you go over to PacWestBigfoot.com and you can sign up right there. But it will be a coffee mug with Petty on it, so enjoy. Right now, I just want to say thank you guys for being here and all your kind comments and everything else. And let me take a sip of this awesome Sasquatch coffee. All right. And let's get to our latest little encounter story. Now, this one, real quick, is a first-hand telling. So I just want to let you know that. Actually, this is a first-hand story that I received from the individual. And while he does not want to, well, basically wants to keep his anonymity right now and does not want to do any live interviews, he's thinking about it, and hopefully he will, because I would love to sit down and go through this one. It was just awesome. So here we go. Let's get going with this. Teenager watches family of Bigfoot by lake in Washington State. Church camp. Since I was 9 years old, I'd been attending, and just so you know, I loved it. However, when I was 13 and put myself in mortal danger as I watched a family of Bigfoot by a lake one morning, I started attending a new one for the rest of my teen years. I know my encounter sounds wild and crazy, but today I am a believer that is a believer. Here's my encounter, and when I get enough courage to do it, I will sit down and share it on one of your interviews, Dave. Church camper bust. I currently serve in the missions field, but when I'm at home in the U.S., I live about 45 minutes east of a pretty popular campground and lake, the place of my encounter when I was 13 years old. And yes, I had a near face-to-face encounter with these creatures, just so you know. It all started the last day of church camp that year near the lake itself. Of course, it was a few miles or so hike into the lake from the campground, but it was nothing a teenager could not handle, as the trail was mostly flat, not completely, of course, but mostly. My group, the Koinonia Kids, we called ourselves, hiked out there 2 days before in about 35 minutes. Even our leader, at the ripe old age of 30 at the time, made it without huffing and puffing his way there and back. So, suffice it to say, it was not a real hike-through of any kind, more of a long walk if you ask anyone who has been to this particular area. For now, I do not want to name the lake. I just think I should keep that to myself. But it is a church camp in the state of Washington, around the center part of Washington. Anyways, I am not a loner by any means, but I do like to make things into an adventure of sorts from time to time. And as far as friends were concerned back then, well, it was a newer crowd at camp that year, so I still did not know much of anyone real well by the end of the week. So, why not, I thought. Why not have a little alone time and adventure? I decided I would day trip it over to the lake, as that last day and night was free time anyways. As long as I was back by service later that afternoon, I don't think anybody would have missed me. That year was a pretty large crowd, too. Another reason for not getting to know too many people. There was just so many of them there. So that was it. I was going to take a quick trip to the lake that morning alone. The lake. I ate breakfast and headed over to the cabin swiftly and hopefully without being spotted to gather up my backpack and put in some snacks I grabbed from the cafeteria. From there, it was simply to set it down outside on the far side of the cabin next to where the forest encroached the property, and then simply wait for people to not notice me and slip away. It did not take long, actually. The second I put that pack down and came around the side of the cabin, I don't remember seeing a single soul. So I ran back over, put the backpack on, and hit the trail. Like I said, it was not a real rough trail, and getting from point A to point B, lake, was barely 2.8 miles. In about 30 minutes, I was already approaching the top of the ridge where the trail was and would descend down to the lake's shoreline. It was a beautiful morning, too. Hardly a cloud in the sky, and being Friday morning, there would not be a soul at that little lake, most likely. At least not that early. It was almost 8 a.m. by the time I hit the ridge and could see clear across the lake itself. I was right. There was not a boat on the lake yet. However, the lake did have some visitors other than me, and I was about to see them, and practically meet one of them face to butt. Seriously, I said B-U-T-T. And just so you know, when something like Bigfoot steps out into reality, I get it when people state that it really does flip your little world upside down, and you soon have a new respect for creation and what it contains. I know I'm not the only person to say this, but I get it now. I really get it. The kids on the shore. Where I was on the trail, on top of the ridge to be exact, allowed me to have a pretty good view of the lake, the whole lake. After I would start to descend, however, I would lose sight of it, as trees, low brush, and such would get in the way. The trail at that point split both to east and to the west. I would be heading west to the smaller part of the lake, a little spot where there was a type of lagoon area I remembered from the other day. Heading down, I did not have any weird senses or feelings or anything like that. It was just another ordinary yet adventurous day outdoors. And apparently, as I rounded a part of the trail that put me about 40 to 50 yards from the shoreline and the lagoon area, I was not the only person to have an adventurous day there. While I thought it was a little early and cold to be wandering in the water, or wading in the water, I noticed two individuals there. They were about knee-deep in it, to be exact. At first I thought they were two kids squatting down in the water picking things from the lake bed beneath it. To be honest, it took me a few moments to realize that both these kids were wearing dark suits, or at least it looked like that at first. It was not until they stood up that I realized that these kids were, well, covered in wet, matted hair. That is when I started feeling odd. Not before. It was at that moment when they stood up and you could see the water running down their long, gangling arms that I started to feel off. And that is when I noticed that they were not kids either. They looked like, well, monkey-like creatures or animals. One was taller than the other, and while I only got to look at them for about 15 to 20 seconds, that was long enough to see that they were not people. They were something else, something I'd never seen before. They stood up and both looked to the left towards a group of trees and thick brush that almost butted up to the water itself if it were not for some of the large boulders between the water's edge and those trees. At that moment my heart almost stopped as literal monsters from my wildest nightmares stepped out from the trees, motioning with their hands to the smaller ones. Doing my research today, from time to time, the closest I've come to seeing again what I saw that day was, and is, both the Patty film Sasquatch and one from the national park some guy did years ago as it walked out in front of the frame. And I can't remember the name of it right now, but I'm sure that you know the one I'm talking about. They were both a little lighter in color than that of the younger ones who were now walking towards the larger creatures. The young ones did. They had these long arms that literally went down past their knees like the larger ones, and they walked kind of funny. Bigfoot. And at that moment I was finally getting a real sense of what I was seeing. I had heard the stories before. I was and am from the state of Washington. It's almost part of the culture here to know or at least have heard about these things in the woods, these so-called hairy people the natives and locals talk about from time to time. It started to also come to me that this was a family unit of some kind. How could I tell? Well, I got a pretty good look at the young ones and the older ones. And, well, one was female and the other was male, the larger one, that is. I will not go into much about the male, but you could tell that he was male. He was taller, darker than the other adult Bigfoot. The other one had breasts. You could see them plain as day. She was at least 7 feet tall and a touch lighter in hair color than the male, and both were lighter than the younger ones who were jet black. They were more brown than black, the older ones, and when the sun hit them, when they moved in and out of the shaded trees, you could see a hint of even reddish in the color of the hair. As I watched them, the female looked to be speaking almost to the young ones, and that is when I noticed the male slip back into the trees and out of sight. Now I was getting scared, really scared. Where did he go? I was alone, not a soul around, not even on the lake. Who would hear me if I was attacked? Who would know where to look if I was mauled by a wild animal? It was at that moment that the male appeared again, and although he did My heart was still skipping a beat, and the fear was still growing. I was staring at monsters. At least to a 13-year-old, they were monsters. The male seemed to have a haunch of a deer flung over his shoulder, or some deer-like leg. Could have been an elk, maybe. Either way, that vision alone at that moment was part of the reason the fear kept growing in me. He motioned with his arm to the female, and they all seemed to move into the trees. I noticed the male turn to look out across the lake, and then, to my horror, up the mountainside in my direction. Fortunately, moments before, I had taken a little refuge behind some brush when I first noticed what I was looking at, and that they were not children, at least not human children. The faces, I could not make them out so much from this distance, the distance I was standing, but I could tell that they had more of a flat face or head, and no real neck to speak of. The younger ones, however, they seemed to have at least some neck, not much, but more than the adults. The motions they made to each other were usually simple hand gestures, like when your mom would wave you over to her when out and about and you walked off too far. I could tell they were vocally communicating, but I could not hear anything from that far away, as I stated earlier. It just looked like they were. These Bigfoot were massive in size, though, and between that fact and the bloody haunch over the male's shoulder as it disappeared back into the trees, I started feeling a surge of fear running through me again. It was time to get up and leave. Grandpa Bigfoot. I did not get even 50 feet away when I knew something was very, very wrong. I heard 2 knocks from down towards the lake, not even 40 yards away at the moment. But that was not the sound that freaked me out. It was the 3 knocks that came back in response to the other 2, and the fact that they were coming from above the trail from me, and it made me stop in my tracks. At that moment, I had a feeling that I needed to get low and hide. Something in my gut, probably the good Lord, told me to find cover. Fortunately, it was not hard in this area. To the right and the left of the trail was thick brush and trees from which to take cover in. I got down and crawled under some heavy brush near 3 tall trees. Even now, I remember that moment like it was yesterday. Of course, I could see the trail clearly, but anyone or anything coming down this trail, I believe, would have a hard time seeing me unless they were really looking. Do you know that feeling when someone is walking through a house or even a big person running along the ground or floor and you can feel it? Well, that is exactly what I started feeling just moments later. The vibration and sound of something large was coming down from above the trail. And this thing was not quiet either. The sound of cracking branches and whatnot under feet could be heard clearly as well. I am glad I listened to that small voice, that small quiet voice. The next thing I saw was a nearly 8 to 9 foot tall monster of a thing standing about 15 feet to my right, smack dab in the middle of the trail. I could hear it breathing. It would take in long pools of air, and it would sound like wheezing when it exhaled. I could tell this Bigfoot was old. His face was wrinkled, ashen gray with patches of yellow around the sunken dark eyes below a very heavy brow line. I guess you could say that the yellow looked like someone who would have jaundice, I suppose. The face was long, and I guess you could say it drooped down. Maybe it was because it was older than the others was the reason it did, but I did not get to see the faces of the others as well, so I could not really compare. The thing was also covered in dark gray hair, and it stunk to high heaven. Fortunately, I was downwind. Although I could smell it, I prayed and guessed it could not smell me. I could see, well, what I thought was dark dung there and here and there along its backside, stuck to its hairy buttocks as well. And I really think between that and this thing just looking scary and decrepit added to its awful smell. I had to put my nose down into my arm, but I could still see this thing from the waist down. The arms were just as long as the other Bigfoot I saw moments before. They ran just past the knees. It had a very bad slouch, too, and its feet were huge, but no claws. They looked like toes. Like our toes, just bigger. It leaned over and picked up a large stick, basically a large limb, really, that had fallen from the tree. It smacked it 3 times against it. Seconds later, 2 knocks could be heard from down below near the lake. I have to say, I was as still and quiet as a church mouse, but I was afraid that my heart was beating so fast and hard that the sound of it would give me away. It was a few seconds later that that monster, started to move down the side of the hill towards the lake. I was still too scared to move and was not sure there were any more of these Bigfoot animals around. I could all of a sudden hear, I guess what you could call chatter or babbling for a few moments. Eventually, though, I felt the need to get up and go as quickly as possible just in case they started making their way back up the hillside in my direction. Still, as quiet as a church mouse, I got up, softly, started walking along the trail back the way I came. I made no mention of my side trip to the lake when I returned. Besides, who would have believed me about what I saw? All I knew was if I did, I might get into some serious trouble. And trouble was not what I wanted at that time. Personally, I just wanted to calm down and gather myself. I collapsed in the cabin and fell asleep for a couple hours, I remember. The stress, the fear, the almost bursting of my heart that morning did me in. I also remember that night at the last evening service just being thankful that I made it out of there alive. They are real, they are wild, and they are massive. Years later, and still Bigfoot on the brain. I have Bigfoot on the brain to this day, but I am not out here doing research. As a matter of fact, I've since grown up and moved to the big city when I am back home from missions. After that event, I seriously do not venture outdoors into the wilds of the Pacific Northwest as much today, at least not as far. I can do my research by visiting your website or our mutual friend's website and catching up on the latest news stories and encounters there. I like the BFRO as well, pretty up-to-date stuff there. Not that I'm all that afraid of the dark or of things that go bump in the night. I'm simply just not interested in having another encounter with something like that ever again. Ever. There's something in the woods that does worry me, and it's not bears, cougars, or the dark itself. It's Bigfoot. While they might be animals that would rather avoid you and me, they are, as I could tell that day, wild animal and predators. And like any predator, it is best to avoid them as much as possible, I believe. Thanks.